The wind came early that October
Heavy.
afternoon in 1902,
I've
carrying with it the
got
kind
it.
of cold that made old
Careful.
men think about the years behind them. Isaac Whitlock stood on the porch of his Kansas farmhouse,
Easy.
70 years pressing on
Just
his
like
shoulders,
that.
like the weight of all those
No, I've
winters he
got
had
it.
survived.
Almost done.
His grandson
It
Daniel,
looks
12 years old,
secure.
and still soft with youth, worked beside him, stacking straw bales against the north wall of the barn with the careful movements of someone following instructions he did not yet understand. The boy paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill.
All
He looked
right,
at his grandfather
boys,
with that
let's
particular
get these
expression young
buckets
people
filled.
wear when
Yes,
they think the
sir.
old ways make no sense. Why do we do this every year, Grandpa? Last winter wasn't even that cold.
It's not
Isaac did not
much,
answer
but it's
immediately.
all
He
we
let the
have.
question hang in the air
We
between them,
must
let
make
the
it
wind carry it around for a
suffice.
moment before he
The
spoke. His voice,
children
when it
need
came, had the
warmth.
texture of creek
We'll
stones smoothed by
manage.
decades of water running over them.
Stack it by the
Let me tell you
barn.
about the winter of
Yes, sir.
1874.
The
The
path
winter
was
that taught me
clear.
the smartest man in
Good.
any room
Keep
is
the
not the one
pace.
who never makes mistakes. It's the one who has the courage to admit when he's wrong. The boy straightened, interested now. Grandpa, what were you wrong about? Isaac looked out across the land that had been his home for more than 40 years. The barn stood solid and square, its north wall already half covered in golden straw. The field stretched flat to the horizon, that Kansas of flatness that lets you see weather coming from 20 miles away. He saw it all, but in his mind, he was seeing something else. Something from 28 years ago when he had been 42 years old and certain he knew everything about survival. Everything, he said quietly. I was wrong about everything, and it almost killed my family. The old man settled himself on the porch step, and his grandson sat beside him. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon, painting the straw walls the color of honey and fire. Isaac closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he was no longer seeing 1902. He was seeing November of 1874, and the man he used to be. I was 42 that winter. I had survived 3 Kansas winters before that one. I had survived the war before that. I had buried my wife and was raising 2 boys alone. I thought I knew everything there was to know about staying alive. His voice changed, then dropping deeper, becoming the voice of a younger man, a harder man, a man who had not yet learned what winter could teach. The memory took him, pulled him down into it like a stone sinking through water, and he began to tell the story. November 1874 arrived with the kind of clarity that tricks men into thinking winter might be gentle. The sky held that hard blue color that comes before the real cold, and Isaac Whitlock stood at the edge of his property, watching the new widow work on her barn. Margaret Brennan had come to Kansas that spring with her 17-year-old daughter and $87 earned from selling her dead husband's tools. She was Irish, her voice still carrying the music of County Cork beneath the careful American words she chose. Isaac had helped raise the frame of her barn that summer, and he had told his brother afterward that the widow understood load-bearing better than half the men who called themselves carpenters. But understanding carpentry and understanding Kansas winter were different animals entirely. He stood there that afternoon, tall and straight-backed, the way former cavalry soldiers stand. 3 years since his wife Anna had died, bringing Thomas into the world. 3 years of raising Samuel, who was 19 now, and Thomas, who was 14. 3 years of being both father and mother, of making every decision alone, of carrying the weight of 2 lives in addition to his own. He had learned to carry that weight. He had learned to be certain to be the man others looked to when they needed to know the right way to do something. In this community of 30 families scattered across the township, Isaac Whitlock was the man who knew how to survive winter. So when he saw Margaret Brennan stacking firewood inside her barn, right up against the north wall, he knew he had to say something. He rode his horse across the property line, watching as she worked with that same methodical patience she brought to everything. Her daughter Beth was helping the two of them, moving in the synchronized rhythm of people who had worked together for years. You've put your wood on the north side, he called out as he approached. Margaret looked up from where she was setting a log precisely in place. Her face, weathered by work and grief, showed neither surprise nor concern. That's where the cold hits, she said simply. It hits everywhere. He said it with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious. By January, that wood will be frozen solid. You'll be splitting logs inside your own barn just to keep warm. She listened, her hands never stopping their work. Thank you for the warning, she said. Isaac waited, expecting her to ask for advice, to want him to show her the right way. But she just kept stacking wood against that north wall, and after a moment he rode away satisfied that he had done his neighborly duty. In his mind, the thought formed clear and certain. She'll learn, the hard way. They always do. That night, alone in his house after his sons had gone to bed, Isaac sat by the fire and cleaned his rifle. It was a habit from the war, this ritual of maintenance, of keeping his weapon ready. Samuel and Thomas were asleep upstairs, their breathing steady through the floorboards. The house was quiet except for the fire and the small sounds of metal on metal as he worked. But in the quiet other sounds came memories. The year had been 1871. Illinois, not Kansas. Isaac and his brother James, both of them trying to build something after the war, had taken 4 years of their lives. They had been doing well, two farms side by side, helping each other through the seasons. James had stacked straw near the shed. For bedding, he said, for the livestock. Isaac had warned him, straw and fire don't mix, brother, not in this wind. James had laughed it off. I'm careful, he had said, but careful is not the same as safe. One night in October, sparks from the forge had drifted on the wind. Just a few glowing pieces of ash carried on air that should have been still but was not. The straw had caught. Isaac could still see it when he closed his eyes. The way fire moves when it has fuel and wind together, like a living thing, like something that hunts. He had seen fires in the war, deliberate fires set to burn Confederate supply lines, and this had moved the same way, fast and hungry and without mercy. They had fought it for 3 hours, saved most of the barn. But James's hands, his brother's hands that had held a rifle through 4 years of war without a scratch, had been burned so badly he could not close them for weeks after. Even when they healed, they were never the same. Scars webbed across the palms, the fingers stiff. A year later, James sold his farm and moved to the city, unable to work the land anymore. Before he left, James had put his ruined hands on Isaac's shoulders. Straw and fire never mix, Isaac. Remember that. Isaac looked down at his own hands in the firelight. The scars there were smaller, just marks across the backs of his fingers, but they were enough to remember, enough to know. That was why he never kept straw near his barn. That was why he knew Margaret Brennan was making a deadly mistake. The fire pop bringing him back. Upstairs, he heard footsteps. Samuel came down, unable to sleep the way young men often are when their minds are turning things over. Pa, you think Mrs. Brennan's going to be all right? Isaac did not look up from his work. If she listens. Beth says her mother learned this method in Ireland. Says it worked there. Ireland is not Kansas. Isaac said, his voice harder than he intended. The wind here is different. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Is it? It's all north wind. Isaac's hands stopped moving. He looked at his eldest son, saw something in the boy's face that irritated him, that young certainty that the old ways might be wrong, that new ideas might be better. Don't be clever. Experience matters, yes, sir, Samuel said, and went back upstairs. Isaac sat alone again, staring into the fire. But his son's question stayed with him, unwelcome. Is it all north wind? As if wind in different places might behave the same way. As if the principles that worked in Ireland might work in Kansas. No. He pushed the thought away. Experience was what mattered. He had seen what fire could do. He had seen his brother's hands. He would not let that happen to his family. If that meant staying certain, staying hard against new ideas from foreign widows who did not know this land, then that was the price of keeping his son safe. Outside, the wind picked up. Winter was coming, and Isaac Whitlock knew exactly how to survive it, or so he thought. Early November brought the first real work of the season. Isaac rode past the Brennan farm one afternoon and saw something that made his heart drop into his stomach. Margaret and Beth were stacking straw bales. Not inside the barn, outside, against the walls. 2 bales deep, pressed tight to the wooden siding, running the entire length of the north wall and wrapping around to the west side. Samuel was there helping them lift the bales. Isaac pulled his horse to a stop, staring. For a long moment, he could not make sense of what he was seeing. It looked like preparation for a bonfire, like someone building kindling around their own structure, just waiting for a spark. What are you doing? The words came out sharper than he intended. Margaret straightened from her work, brushing loose straw from her apron. Making a coat, she said. For the barn. Isaac dismounted, looked at the wall of straw, at the careful way it was stacked, at the precision of the placement. You're wrapping your barn in straw. Yes, he felt anger rising hot and tight in his chest. Not anger at her, not really. Anger at the danger, anger at the foolishness, anger at his son for being part of it. Straw burns, he said, fighting to keep his voice level. Everything burns. The simplicity of her answer caught him off guard. He stared at her. You're building a fire pile against your own wall. One spark in this wind, and you'll lose the barn and everything in it. Margaret met his eyes calmly. The lantern hangs from the center beam. The door stays on the south side. I leave space around it. The straw stays dry until snow comes. Snow helps. Isaac shook his head. This was madness. You'll draw mice, rot the boards, trap moisture. She did not argue. She just went back to stacking. He turned to Samuel, who was standing there holding a bale, looking uncomfortable. His son had the grace to look ashamed, at least. You're helping with this, Beth asked, Samuel said quietly. I thought it wouldn't hurt to help lift. Come home. Now, Samuel set down the bale and followed his father. They rode back in silence, but Isaac could feel the tension between them, like a physical thing. That night after supper, after Thomas had gone to bed, Isaac faced his eldest son across the kitchen table. You don't help with that anymore. Why not, Pa? It's just straw, because it's a dangerous idea and I don't want you involved when it goes wrong. Samuel's jaw set in that stubborn way he had inherited from his mother. Mrs. Brennan says she did this in Ireland for 20 years. I don't care what Ireland did. This is Kansas. And in Kansas, straw near a barn means fire risk. Thomas appeared in the doorway, small and quiet in his nightshirt. But Pa, what if it works? Isaac looked at his younger son, seeing the hope there. The desire to believe that problems might have new solutions. It won't work. And when it fails, I don't want this family caught up in it. Beth says they need to save money, Samuel said. Says they have to make the land payment in April. If they can't save on firewood, they won't have enough. That's their problem, not ours. But Isaac knew that was not entirely true. If the Brennans failed, if they lost their land, part of it would be his fault for not intervening strongly enough. But if he intervened and they burned, that would be his fault too. He could not win. So he chose the path he knew was safe. Stay away. Samuel went to bed without another word. Isaac sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the house settle around him. Outside, the wind tested the corners and edges of his barn, looking for weakness, finding none. Because Isaac knew how to build, knew how to prepare, knew how to survive. In 3 weeks, the township would hold its regular meeting, and Isaac knew that Margaret Brennan's straw wall would be the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. The meeting took place at Jacob Harlow's house, the front room packed with 30 people crowded together, their breath fogging in the cold air that leaked through every wall. These gatherings happened every month through winter, a way to coordinate help, to share information, to make decisions that affected them all. But tonight there was only one topic that mattered. Duncan Mercer stood near the fire, his cavalry officer's posture still evident 20 years after the war. He had fought alongside Isaac, had saved Isaac's life once during a skirmish outside Vicksburg. They were friends, or as close to friends as two proud men could be. Mercer's voice cut through the low conversation. We need to discuss fire hazards. The room went quiet. Everyone knew what he meant. Margaret Brennan sat near the back, the only woman present, without a husband standing beside her. Beth had stayed home. Margaret's face showed nothing, but Isaac saw her hands folded carefully in her lap, tightened just slightly. Mrs. Brennan has constructed what amounts to a tinderbox against her barn, Mercer continued. In this wind, one spark could spread to neighboring properties. This is not just her concern. It's all of ours. Margaret stood. Her movement was calm, unhurried. She had the composure of someone who had faced worse than the judgment of neighbors. I've taken precautions, she said. The lantern is hung high. The door faces away from the wind. The straw is kept dry. Until it's not. Mercer said, until snow melts. Until a mouse makes a nest and catches a spark. Jacob Harlow spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had built barns for 20 years. I've seen straw walls rot boards, trap moisture. The wood decays, the structure fails. My father used this method for 20 years, Margaret said. No fires, no rot. Mercer's response was quick and cutting. This isn't Ireland, Mrs. Brennan. Every eye in the room turned to Isaac. He felt the weight of that attention, felt the expectation. He was the veteran, the survivor, the man people trusted. What he said next would matter. In his mind, two voices fought. One said, "Tell the truth. You saw straw burn. You saw how fast it spread. You can't let this happen." The other said, "She's alone, no husband. You know what they'll do if you don't defend her." Isaac stood slowly. The room waited. "I've seen straw burn," he said, each word chosen carefully. "I've seen it spread." Margaret looked at him, not pleading, not angry, just waiting. "But Mrs. Brennan has the right to manage her property as she sees fit. As long as fire doesn't spread to others." It was a compromise position. He had not defended her method, but he had not condemned her either. It satisfied no one and protected everyone. Mercer pushed harder. "I propose we require all non-standard winter structures to be inspected and approved." Reverend Cole intervened, his voice gentle but firm. "We're neighbors, not a town council. We can't require anything of each other beyond basic decency." "Then come spring," Mercer said, "if this works, fine. If it fails, if anyone's property is damaged, Mrs. Brennan bears full responsibility." Margaret's voice was steady. "Agreed." The meeting ended with tension thick enough to cut. People filed out into the cold night, their conversations low and worried. Isaac watched Margaret walk to her wagon, her back straight, her step steady. He wanted to say something to explain his position, but what could he say? "I chose safety over supporting you. I chose my reputation over your idea." Samuel was waiting by their wagon. When Isaac climbed up beside him, the boy spoke quietly. "You could have defended her more. I told the truth. You told part of the truth. The part that makes you still look right." Isaac's hands tightened on the reins. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not sure her method will fail. You're just scared it might work. Get home. Now." But after Samuel climbed down and walked away into the darkness, Isaac sat alone on the wagon, and he knew his son was right. He was not afraid the straw wall would fail. He was afraid it would succeed, because if it succeeded, that meant he had been wrong for 3 years. It meant his experience, his certainty, everything he thought he knew might be worthless. And that was a kind of cold no straw wall could protect against. The first real cold snap came in mid-November. The temperature dropped from 32 degrees to 5 below in a single afternoon. The wind came straight out of the north, steady at 15 miles per hour, rising to 20 by nightfall. Isaac banked his stove early, fed it again before bed. At midnight, he rose to feed it once more. The house creaked and groaned around him like a ship in heavy seas. By morning, frost had feathered the inside of his north barn wall in intricate patterns like frozen ferns. His woodpile, the one stacked near that north wall, had developed a sheen he did not like. When he touched the logs, they felt wrong. Too cold, damp somehow, even though there was no liquid water to make them so. Moisture from somewhere freezing and refreezing in cycles. He broke ice in the cow trough with the back of his axe. The sound rang out sharp and hard in the morning air. That evening, Thomas reported that frost was building on the inside barn walls, that the animals were restless from the cold. Isaac nodded grimly. He had expected that. Everything would be harder, but that was winter. That was the price of this land. What he had not expected was what Samuel told him later that night. His son had not asked permission. He had simply ridden past the Brennan farm on an errand, and he had looked, just looked. And what he saw had stayed with him all day until he could not keep it to himself any longer. "Mrs. Brennan's barn is different, Pa." Isaac did not look up from the harness he was mending. "One night doesn't prove anything. The north wall is buried halfway in snow. The straw is packed so tight under the snow you can barely see it. And the wind, when it hits that wall, it just breaks apart, doesn't go through." Isaac's hands stilled. Every instinct told him not to ask, but he could not stop himself. And inside Samuel's voice was quiet but certain. "Beth said there's no frost on the inside walls. The water bucket only has a thin skin of ice, not frozen solid. The animals are calm." Isaac wanted to argue, wanted to explain why that could not be right. But the words would not come, because he knew Samuel was not lying. His son had no reason to lie. And if what Samuel said was true, then Margaret Brennan's impossible, dangerous, foolish idea was working. That night, Isaac lay awake listening to the wind. Somewhere across the darkness, beyond the fields and the fence line, Margaret Brennan's barn stood wrapped in its coat of straw and snow. The wind that howled against his walls was breaking itself against hers. And Isaac Whitlock, who had survived a war, in 3 Kansas winters, who had buried a wife and raised 2 sons alone, who knew everything there was to know about staying alive, felt the first crack appear in the certainty that had kept him standing upright for 42 years. 3 days later, the real cold arrived. It did not come gradually. It came like an ambush, like something that had been waiting in the north and decided the time for mercy was over. 20 below zero, then 28, then 32. The wind did not stop. It stripped heat from every surface, reached into cracks and seams, and carried warmth away, as if warmth were a debt being collected. The certainty that had kept Isaac standing was beginning to crumble. Isaac fed his stove nearly constant. The firewood he had cut and stacked so carefully in October, the wood he had been so certain would last until March, began to disappear at a rate that unsettled him. He did the mathematics in his head while he worked. 15 logs a day before the deep cold. 20 now. Sometimes 25 when the wind was particularly vicious. The wood stacked against his north barn wall had begun to do something strange. In daylight, when the winter sun provided its thin, useless heat, moisture would appear on the surface of the logs. Not melting, not water exactly, just dampness, as if the wood itself was sweating. Then at night, that moisture would freeze solid, and the logs would become like iron. Splitting them required twice the effort. Burning them required moving them away from the wall, first letting them warm near the stove before they would catch properly. Labor doubled for half the heat. On the 5th night of sustained cold, something happened that Isaac had been dreading. Thomas came into the house after evening chores, and he was shaking. Not the normal shivering of someone who had been out in the cold. This was deeper, uncontrollable. His lips were gray-blue, his fingers so stiff he could not unfasten his own coat. Isaac moved fast. He stripped the coat off his son, wrapped him in blankets, pushed him close to the stove. Samuel heated water while Isaac rubbed circulation back into Thomas's hands and feet, watching the boy's face for signs of frostbite. The skin was white in places, red in others, but it was not black. "Not yet. You were out there too long," Isaac said, his voice rough with fear he was trying to hide. "I was trying to get the animals settled, Pa. They were so restless. The cold is getting to them." Isaac held his 14-year-old son and felt the weight of his decisions pressing down. This was his fault, his barn, his methods, his certainty that he knew best, and it was nearly killing his child. Samuel stood in the corner watching. When Thomas finally stopped shaking, when his color began to return, Samuel spoke quietly. Mrs. Brennan made her offer, Pa. Isaac did not answer. He kept his hands on Thomas, kept rubbing warmth back into him. Samuel continued, his voice careful. "Her straw is still there, I know." Thomas recovered enough to speak, looked up at his father. "Beth says their barn is barely below freezing inside. They hardly burn any wood at all." Isaac closed his eyes. In his mind, he could see it clearly. Margaret Brennan's barn wrapped in its coat of gold and white, holding the heat that his barn was bleeding away. He could see his woodpile shrinking, could calculate exactly when it would run out. Late February, maybe early March, if he was lucky. And then, what? Burn the furniture, burn the fences, let his sons freeze while he clung to pride. He thought of Anna, his wife, her last words before she slipped away after Thomas was born. "Don't let pride kill you, Isaac. Promise me." He had promised. "Morning," Isaac said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll go in the morning." Isaac did not sleep that night. He lay in his sin, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind test every board and beam of his house. In the darkness, he fought the hardest battle of his life. Not against the cold, against himself. He had survived 4 years of war, had seen men die from dozens of different causes. Bullets and disease and bad water and infected wounds. But the men who had died from pride, those deaths had been the most senseless. The lieutenant who refused to retreat. The sergeant who would not ask for help. The soldier who insisted he could make the run alone. Pride had killed more men in that war than Confederate bullets ever did. Isaac had sworn he would never be that kind of fool. And yet here he was lying in the dark, his son barely recovered from near frostbite, his woodpile 3 weeks from empty, and still something in him resisted. Still some part of him wanted to find another way, any way that did not require walking up to Margaret Brennan's door and admitting he had been wrong. But this was not about war. This was worse. This was about standing in front of the entire community and acknowledging that a widow and immigrant, a woman who had been here less than a year, knew something he did not. This was about watching his reputation, the respect he had built over 3 years of successful survival, crack apart like ice on a pond. He thought about what Samuel had said. You're not scared it will fail. You're scared it might work. His son understood him too well. The hours crawled past. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Isaac realized he had made his decision. Not because he wanted to, not because it felt right, but because the alternative was watching his children suffer for his ego. Anna had made him promise. And if keeping that promise meant shattering his pride into 1,000 pieces, then that was what he would do. When dawn came gray and cold and offering no comfort, Isaac rose and dressed in silence. Samuel appeared in the kitchen as Isaac was pulling on his heaviest coat. Do you want me to come with you? Isaac shook his head. No, this is something I have to do alone. The ride to Margaret Brennan's farm was 2 miles. It felt like 200. The frozen fog made visibility almost nothing. The temperature was 40 below. Every breath Isaac took felt like inhaling broken glass. His horse moved reluctantly, and Isaac could not blame the animal. Every part of him wanted to turn back. When he reached Margaret's door, he sat on his horse for a full minute, maybe longer. This was the moment where 42 years of being Isaac Whitlock, the man who knew the man others trusted, ended. After this, he would be something else. Something smaller, maybe. Something humbled. He dismounted, walked to the door, stood there with his hand raised to knock. This was the longest moment of his life. Then he knocked. Margaret opened the door. She had been awake, had been making breakfast. The smell of coffee drifted out impossibly inviting. Her face, when she saw him, showed no surprise, no triumph, just understanding. You said you had spare straw, Isaac managed. The words felt like they were being dragged out of him with hooks. Yes, I'd like to buy some. You can have it, I'll pay. You helped with my cow, with raising my barn. Consider it paid. Isaac stood there, his throat tight. He had prepared 100 different ways to say this, and none of them would come. Finally, the truth forced itself out in a whisper, rough as gravel. I was wrong about your method. Margaret's voice was gentle. You were cautious. That's not wrong, I laughed at you. In my head, I called it foolish. Most people did. Out loud. Isaac looked at her directly then, and something in him broke. How did you keep trying knowing everyone thought you were wrong? Because I've been cold before Mr. Whitlock. Real cold. The kind that kills. I won't be that cold again if I can help it. In her eyes, Isaac saw something he recognized. Not war, but survival. A different kind of battlefield, but the same determination. The same scars. They loaded 6 bales of straw onto his wagon together. Margaret worked alongside him without comment, without making the moment harder than it already was. When they finished, Isaac stood by the wagon trying to find words. Is this enough for your north wall, 2 bales deep, yes? Isaac nodded, started to climb up, then stopped. Mrs. Brennan, thank you. Not just for the straw. She understood what he meant. She nodded once, and that was enough. Isaac drove home through the frozen morning, and something in him felt simultaneously heavier and lighter than it had in years. He had lost something today, but maybe he had gained something more important. That evening, Isaac and Samuel worked in the barn without speaking, Mo. Thomas watched from inside the house, still recovering. The two of them cut the twine on the first bale and set it upright against the north wall, pressing it tight to the boards exactly as Margaret had done. Samuel, what did Beth tell you about how her mother learned this? Samuel looked up, surprised by the question. She said Mrs. Brennan's father did it in Ireland, during the famine, when people were dying from cold as much as hunger. He learned to use everything, waste nothing. Isaac thought about that as they worked. A man in Ireland, facing death, figuring out how to beat the wind. And here, 30 years later, in 4,000 miles away, that same knowledge saving another generation. They stacked 2 bales deep the way Margaret had instructed, left a gap at the south corner, near the door, tamped loose straw into the seams with the back of a shovel, stamped the base firm with their boots. The wind struck the wall as if in argument, but the straw did not move. By morning, snow had drifted against the outer layer, sealing it in a white crust that would only add to the insulation. Isaac stepped into the barn at first light and stood absolutely still, feeling the difference. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might miss if you were not paying attention. But it was there. The north wall no longer carried that knife-edged chill. The draft that used to slip through nail holes and board seams had quieted to almost nothing. The cow's breath rose in clouds that lingered instead of being snatched away by moving air. Isaac ran his hand along the boards. They felt like wood, not ice. Thomas appeared beside him, bundled in coats, but looking healthier. It worked, Pa. It's one night, Isaac said automatically, but he knew it had worked. By the next Sunday, half the township knew that Isaac Whitlock had wrapped his barn in straw. Jacob Harlow rode past on Thursday and stopped staring at the north wall. You wrapping yours now? Isaac kept working, stacking another bale higher. Trying something, thought it was foolish. Isaac straightened and met Harlow's eyes. So did I. I was wrong. The honesty of it stopped Harlow cold. He studied the wall, then Isaac, then the wall again. Mercer's going to have opinions about this. Mercer can keep them, Isaac said quietly. Duncan Mercer arrived that afternoon, his beard crusted with frost, his eyes hard. Isaac saw him coming and set down his tools, waiting. I hear you've taken to old country habits. I've taken to not freezing. Mercer walked around the north side of the barn, boots crunching in the snow. He kicked lightly at the base of the straw wall, testing it. Fire hazard, less than a frozen herd. You burn this place down, you'll take half the county with you. I've got water buckets set. Lantern stays high, door gap stays open. Mercer turned to face him. You know what this looks like? Looks like the widow was right and we were wrong. She was right, Isaac said simply. We're supposed to be the experienced ones, the ones who know. Experience can blind you, Isaac said. I learned that the hard way. Mercer stared at him for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse and rode away without another word. But 3 nights later, when the temperature dropped to 38 below, and Mercer woke to find his stove had died and his first hog frozen in its pen, he rode to Isaac's place at dawn. You got spare bales? Isaac looked at his old war friend, saw the cost of those words in Mercer's face. Phew. I'll pay. Just haul them. They loaded 8 bales together in silence. The friendship between them had bent, but not broken. When Mercer was ready to leave, he paused. Thank you. Thank Meg, Isaac said. She's the one who knew. Mercer rode toward the Brennan farm without another word. The great blizzard came in the 3rd week of January. The temperature fell to 42 below. The wind rose to 35 miles per hour, sustained with gusts reaching 50. Snow fell horizontal, turning the world into a white roar that lasted 36 hours. Isaac and Samuel worked together through it, checking the straw wall, packing snow tighter, where ice was building at the corners, learning in real time how to maintain what they had built. The barn held, not perfectly, but well enough. Inside, the temperature stayed around 25 degrees. The animals survived. The wood lasted. At the Brennan farm, Margaret and Beth simply waited it out. Their barn, with 2 years of experience behind its construction, held steady at around 30 degrees. They burned almost nothing. At Mercer's place, where the straw had been installed just days before, it was rougher. But it held. His second hog survived. The horse survived. And Mercer, working alone through that endless 36 hours, learned what Isaac had learned, what Margaret had known from the beginning. Stop the wind, keep the heat. Everything else follows. On the morning of the 3rd day, when the wind finally died and the sun broke through, Mercer rode to Margaret's farm. He dismounted at her door, hat in his hands. Mrs. Brennan, he said when she answered, I came to say I was wrong about your method. You came to thank me for the straw, she replied gently. That too. She could have made it harder, could have pointed out everything he had said at the township meeting, but she did not. You can have more if you need it, she said. Payment is, you stop telling others it won't work. Fair terms. They loaded straw together, and when they were done, Mercer asked the question that had been eating at him. Why did you offer it to me after what I said? Margaret looked at him directly. Because cold doesn't care about pride, Mr. Mercer. Neither do I. Isaac had ridden over to check on his own straw wall when he saw Mercer's wagon at Margaret's place. He dismounted quietly, not wanting to interrupt, but close enough to hear. Mercer nodded slowly, climbed onto his wagon, and rode away. But before he was out of earshot, he said something so quietly Isaac almost missed it. She's a better person than I am. By February 9, barns in the township wore straw mantles. The pattern was clear. Barns with straw lost fewer animals, used less wood, required fewer midnight feedings. The difference was not dramatic, but it was measurable. And on the prairie, measurable meant everything. Late February brought the first thaw. Water ran along the edges of drifts, darkening the snow, turning the world soft after months of frozen hardness. Isaac stood in his barn, pulling down the straw mantle, bale by bale examining the boards behind it. Dry, unwrapped, untouched by frost. Samuel worked beside him, both of them breaking the bales apart, scattering the loose straw across the garden plot, where it would rot down into mulch by spring. Nothing wasted. Everything returned. "We keeping it next year?" Samuel asked, though they both knew the answer. Yes. The word came without hesitation now, without shame. 6 weeks ago, Isaac would have fought that admission. Now it was simply fact. The straw worked. Pride had nearly cost them everything. Humility had saved them. Across the property line, Margaret and Beth were fronting the same work. Isaac walked over carrying a tool Beth had left at his barn weeks ago. It was the first time he had approached her place without needing something, without some crisis driving him. Margaret looked up as he approached. "Mr. Whitlock, Mrs. Brennan." He held out the tool. "Beth left this behind, thank you." They stood for a moment in that particular silence that exists between people who have survived something together. Then Isaac spoke, the words coming easier now than they had in January. "You were right about the method." Margaret shook her head gently. "No, Winter was right. We just listened." Isaac considered that. The wind had taught them both, but in different ways. Margaret had known what to listen for. Isaac had needed to learn. "You'll build it again this fall." "Yes, so will I." The simplicity of the exchange held weight. No elaborate thanks, no long explanations, just two people who understood what survival required. 10 days later, Margaret Brennan rode to the county office in Hutchinson with $120 in her pocket. The land agent, a thin man with spectacles and doubt written across his face, counted the money twice. "Mrs. Brennan, didn't think you'd make it. Here's your payment," she said simply. He wrote out the receipt, his pen scratching across paper. "Land's yours for another year." Outside, Beth was waiting with the wagon. "Mother, we did it. We survived," Margaret corrected. "Different thing." But in her eyes, Isaac would have seen something he recognized if he had been there. Not triumph, satisfaction. The deep bone-level satisfaction of having faced the worst and come through intact. That same satisfaction was building across the township. By autumn of 1875, no one argued about straw walls anymore. They argued about the best way to stack them, about whether 2 bales deep was sufficient or if 3 was better, and exposed corners about the timing of when to put them up and when to take them down. The conversation had shifted from whether to how, and in that shift, everything changed. November 1875 brought new faces. Henry Dorset arrived from Missouri with his 2 daughters, a wagon full of hope, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having met a prairie winter. He built his barn the way he had always built barns. 4 walls, solid roof wood, exposed on all sides. Emmett Calloway rode past one afternoon and stopped studying the structure. "You'll want to wrap that north wall." Henry looked up from his work, friendly enough. "With what straw?" Henry laughed, not unkindly. "Won't that burn?" "It will if you're careless," Emmett said. Then after a pause, "We all thought so too once," but Henry had built barns in Missouri for 15 years. He knew what he was doing. He thanked Emmett politely and went back to work. The first hard freeze came in mid-December, 2 days of wind that did not stop temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there. Henry lost 1 horse in the first week. The second weakened rapidly, its breath turning to ice on the inside walls of the barn, its body heat bleeding away into the frozen air. On the 10th day, Henry rode east, his pride as frozen as everything else. He found Emmett in his barn, and the words came hard, but they came. "You still got spare bales?" Emmett did not smile, did not make it easy or difficult. Just loaded 8 bales into Henry's wagon and helped him tie them down. That night, Henry worked alone, stacking straw along his north and west walls by lantern light. His daughters watched from the house window. The work went slowly. His hands were cold, his back ached, and every bale felt like an admission he had not wanted to make. But by morning, the difference was already apparent. The second horse lifted its head when Henry entered. The inside air, while still cold, had stopped that brutal moving quality that sucked heat from everything it touched. 3 days later, Henry rode to Emmett's place. I owe you. Emmett shook his head. You owe Meg. 2 claims over. Henry found Margaret Brennan cutting twine off straw bales, preparing for another winter. She looked up as he dismounted, and something in her face, some deep understanding of what it cost to ask for help, made his prepared speech disappear. I hear I'm late learning, he said simply. Better late than dead. He wanted to say more, wanted to explain why he had not listened, why he had thought he knew better. But Margaret waved away his words before they could form. Thank winter, she said. Winter teaches everyone eventually. They talked for a while, Henry asking questions about maintenance, about fire safety, about the small details that made the method work. And as they talked, Henry understood something Isaac had learned the year before. This was not about one woman's clever idea. This was about paying attention to what worked regardless of where it came from or who thought of it first. By the end of that winter, Henry's barn wore its straw mantle proudly. So did nearly every barn within riding distance. The practice spread beyond their township, carried by travelers and relatives in simple observation. People passing through would stop and ask about the golden walls, and someone would always answer the same way. To keep firewood from turning to ice. It became a saying, a shorthand. When someone left a door open too long, another would call out, careful or your firewood will turn to ice. The language itself had changed, absorbing the lesson, making it permanent. Autumn 1877 arrived with the kind of clarity that makes old lessons feel new again. Isaac stood at the fence line between his property and Margaret's, watching the sun drop toward the western horizon. The years since that first terrible winter had passed with the steady rhythm of seasons, each one adding weight to what they had learned. Margaret appeared on her side of the fence, checking her preparations. They had fallen into this habit, these quiet moments of standing together in the autumn light, not needing to speak much, but finding comfort in the shared understanding. Hard to believe it's been this long, she said finally. Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago, Isaac agreed. Your boys are good men. Beth speaks highly of them. Isaac felt the warmth of that. Samuel and Beth had married the previous spring. Thomas was courting one of Emmett's daughters. The families that had started so far apart had woven together in ways Isaac could not have imagined that first winter. Beth is a fine woman, Isaac said. You raised her well. Alone? Margaret's expression flickered. Not alone, the community helped. Even when they doubted, Isaac felt the weight of that, even when they doubted. Even when he had stood in that township meeting and offered only halfway protection. Even when he had let his pride speak louder than his conscience. I never properly apologized. He said the words coming slow but necessary. For not defending you at that meeting. You defended what you believed, Margaret replied. Can't fault a man for that. But I was wrong. You were careful. You'd lost too much to be reckless. Isaac looked at this woman who had come to Kansas with $87 and an idea everyone had mocked. She had lost her husband, her home, everything familiar. And still, she had the grace to understand why Isaac had hesitated, why his fear had made him small. How did you do it, he asked. How did you keep believing when everyone said you were wrong? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through the grass. Because holding on to pride is just another way of losing, she said finally. My father taught me that. In Ireland during the famine, pride killed as many people as hunger did. The ones who wouldn't ask for help, wouldn't try new things, wouldn't admit they didn't know everything. They died proud, but they died. Isaac nodded slowly. We both learned that winter. Yes. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun touched the horizon, painting the straw walls gold and crimson. Behind them, their barns stood ready for another winter, wrapped in the knowledge that had cost so much to accept and now seemed as natural as breathing. In Isaac's mind, thoughts moved like water finding a path. This was not about the straw. It had never been about the straw. It was about who he wanted to be. What kind of man, what kind of father, what kind of neighbor. In the war, he had learned that the bravest men were not the ones who never felt fear. They were the ones who acted despite it. Here he had learned something similar. The wisest men were not the ones who never made mistakes. They were the ones who admitted when they had. I spent most of my life thinking strength meant never bending. Isaac said quietly, you taught me that real strength is knowing when to bend. Margaret smiled just slightly. I didn't teach you that. Winter did. I just showed you it was possible to survive it. The story might have ended there with lessons learned and friendships forged and winters made survivable. But life on the prairie continued, and with it came the constant need to pass knowledge forward. In the autumn of 1877, a young farmer named Caleb Morris arrived full of new ideas about modern construction. He built his barn with doubled boards on the north wall, convinced that more wood meant more strength. When neighbors mentioned straw, he dismissed it politely. I built it right the first time. That winter was mild. Temperatures rarely dropped below 10 degrees. Some settlers wondered aloud if the straw was really necessary. Maybe that one bad winter had been an exception. Maybe they could save the labor. But Emmett Calloway, remembering, insisted on building his wall anyway. When a younger man questioned the effort, Emmett's answer was simple and final. The year you don't build it is the year you'll need it most. It was not about this winter or last winter. It was about being ready for the worst winter whenever it came. Hope for mild weather, Emmett said. Prepare for brutal weather. And the community listened because they remembered 1874, and memory is the soil where wisdom grows. Caleb Morris's barn stood through that mild winter without straw. But the following year, when the temperatures dropped to 30 below in December, he was at Emmett's door before dawn asking for bales. Some lessons Emmett told him quietly are worth learning before you need them. The wind was picking up now that October afternoon in 1902. Isaac felt it against his face, familiar as an old friend. He had been talking for over an hour, his voice growing rough but his memory staying clear. Daniel sat beside him, 12 years old and silent, taking it all in. So that's what happened, Grandpa. You learned to admit you were wrong. Isaac shook his head slowly. I learned something bigger than that, son. I learned that the strongest man in any room is not the one who never makes mistakes. It's the one who has the courage to say I was wrong when everyone is watching. Daniel thought about that. But everyone says you're the smartest, that you know more than anyone. That's the problem with knowing most, Isaac said gently. It makes you stop learning. He turned to look at his grandson directly, wanting the boy to understand something essential. The hardest part of that whole winter wasn't realizing I was wrong. It was walking up to Mrs. Brennan's door and admitting it. In the war, I faced Confederate rifles, but no day was harder than that one. Because in war, the enemy is out there. That day, the enemy was my own pride. Daniel's young face was serious processing. Will I have to do something like that? Yet Isaac said simply, maybe not about straw and winter, but there will come a time when you have to choose between being right and being righteous, between admitting you're wrong and pretending you're right. And when that time comes, I want you to remember something. What Grandpa, a real man, is not afraid to admit mistakes. He's only afraid of not learning from them. They sat together as the sun touched the horizon, grandfather and grandson. The lesson passed from one generation to the next like a precious tool worn smooth by use, but still sharp where it needed to be. Is Mrs. Brennan still alive? Daniel asked. Isaac's voice grew softer. No, son. She passed in 1885, 11 years after that winter. Did you tell her thank you? Every year, Isaac set his throat tight. Every autumn when I stack these bales, I remember her. And every spring when I scatter the straw back to the earth, I thank her. She didn't need words. She needed the practice to continue. And it has. Isaac Whitlock died in his sleep in the spring of 1903, 71 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren. The entire township attended his funeral. Reverend Cole, older now, but steady, spoke words that captured something essential. Isaac Whitlock came to us as a man of certainty. He left us as a man of wisdom. The difference between those two things is one winter, one widow, and the courage to admit error. Samuel, 48 years old and weathered by his own decades of prairie life, stood with Beth and their children. Their oldest son, Daniel, was 13, now old enough to understand that his grandfather's real legacy was not the land or the barn or the careful preparations. It was the willingness to learn. That autumn, Daniel stacked straw along the north wall of their barn for the first time, working alone while his father supervised. The boy's hands were careful, methodical, following the pattern that had saved his grandfather's life nearly 30 years before. Am I doing it right, Pa? You're doing it how Grandpa taught, Samuel said. That's right. The years turned. The practice spread. By 1910, straw banking was common across central Kansas and into Nebraska. It would remain standard practice until mechanical heating arrived in the middle of the 20th century. The principle stayed true. Stop the wind, keep the heat. In 1920, Daniel Whitlock returned from the Great War carrying his own scars, his own lessons about pride and survival. He was 30 now, teaching his own 8-year-old son to stack the straw walls. Why do we still do this? Mr. Johnson has a heater now. Daniel stopped thinking of his grandfather, of the story told on that autumn evening so many years ago. Because sometimes the old way is still the best way. And because this is not just about keeping a barn warm, this is about remembering that the smartest person in the room is not the one who talks the most. It's the one who listens the most. He knelt down so he could look his son in the eyes. Your great-grandfather learned that from a widow named Margaret Brennan. She taught this whole county how to survive winter. But really, she taught us something bigger. She taught us how to admit when we're wrong. The boy thought about that, his young mind working. And that's important. That's the most important thing there is, Daniel said. They worked together in the autumn light, 3 generations removed from that terrible winter of 1874, but still following the pattern, still respecting the lesson. The straw went up along the north wall, 2 bales deep, pressed tight, ready for whatever winter would bring. And somewhere in the way memory works on the prairie, in the way knowledge passes from hand to hand and heart to heart, Isaac Whitlock and Margaret Brennan stood together in the autumn light, their barns wrapped against the wind, their lesson alive in the hands of children they would never meet. The wind came. It always did. But they had learned to stop it. And in learning that they had learned everything that mattered about being human, the principle stayed true.